Hi, this is Anastasia from U.S. Harbors. I'm here today with Josie Iselin, and she is this wonderful artist who's going to talk to us about her work with seaweed.
My name is Josie Iselin. I live in San Francisco, California, on the side of a very steep hill. We're in my studio, and this is where my artwork happens. So I'm trained as a visual artist. I've been taking photographs since the very beginning, and I got my MFA in a photography department at San Francisco State in the art department. But I've also always been a writer, and so my art and writing have come together in a series of books that I've produced since 2006. I've made maybe 7 or 8 books. So I'm very much about bringing worlds together. My heroes are usually polymaths, and I kind of think of myself that way, all about bringing ideas and media together, and the book format is a great way to do that. So I'm a bookmaker, I'm a designer and bookmaker. A polymath usually refers to someone who's interested in and works in an array of media. Someone who is, I think of Anna Atkins, who is someone who I write about, who was one of the very first users of the cyanotype process, and she was a naturalist. She collected the seaweeds and really learned about them. She was a chemist because she had to learn the chemistry of this nascent photographic process she was using. And she was an artist. She really used all of her knowledge to actually move into a direction of self-expression. So she's known in the art world. So someone who can fit into a number of different professional worlds is usually thought of as a polymath. Because I do an array of things, a day in my life can be really varied. I'm not necessarily the classic artist who has a very regular studio practice. Although those are some of my most cherished days, is when I'm in the studio using my scanner as a camera and scanning seaweeds and making imagery. A very important part of what I do is being out in the public in an array of different audiences and telling these visually driven scientific stories. I've been interested in the ocean my whole life. I grew up as a sailor in Penobscot Bay and spent my summers as a kid in Maine on the water. And being out here in San Francisco, we are surrounded by the ocean. We're very, very lucky to have the ocean very close to us. And as I started making these books, I realized that the beach is this real place of discovery, and it's kind of a portal, a liminal ribbon where we can learn about our ocean world from what we find on the beach. And I was taking a class to become a docent for one of the marine protected area, the reef up north of San Francisco called the Duxbury Reef. And when I was out in the classroom and on the reef learning from a wonderful scientist from the Academy of Sciences, I realized that everyone was focusing on and learning about the nudibranchs and the starfish and the fish and the octopi and the critters. And most of what I was seeing was the marine algae, but there actually was very little being taught about it. And I happened to hold a scrap of the seaweeds up to the sky. It was a beautiful day. The sky was blue, and there was this fantastic magenta color that struck me in the eyeball, and this incredible form. And I knew I wanted to get that particular specimen and other specimens back into my studio, onto my scanner, and start experimenting with pushing light through these seaweed specimens. So that was how it began. It's been a really wonderfully rich domain for me to explore as an artist and as a writer. It's a very, very important domain in our oceans that's been kind of overlooked. There are much more charismatic, as people say, charismatic creatures. The seaweeds and the kelps are the flora of our oceans. So there's a number of reasons. Number one, they are photosynthesizing organisms, so they are very, very important carbon sinks. They use carbon dioxide for their fantastic metabolic growth. and that in turn off gases oxygen. So they are oxygenators of their nearshore waters. They're carbon sinks, which we know is so important right now. And as primary producers, they formulate the base of the food chain. So they are eaten, much like we eat vegetables, they are eaten by herbivores. That's the snails and limpets and crabs and all those things of the ocean that eat the kelp and the seaweed. And then those critters get eaten by larger creatures, and that forms the great and complex food web of the ocean. So they're the base of the food web. And then there's this other reason they're really important, and that is because they are eco-engineers. They actually create habitat. And this habitat, whether it's the kelp forest or the nearer shore understory kelps and seaweeds, are very, very important homes to fish populations and nurseries where not only seals or sea otter or other mammals care for their young, but also invertebrate larval stages need the seaweeds to grow up to be mature adults. The seagrasses are also in there in the estuaries and bays as very, very important habitat. It's where the herring roe settles. And so it can't be overstated at how important the seaweeds and kelps are ecologically for the oceans, for the health of the oceans. And yet I feel like they've never really had their place up there in the big studies about, or the big conversations about the oceans and the health of the oceans. So there's kind of two components to how the connection between nature, art, and science come together for me. And one is in my process of art making, and then the making of these various books. And the art, the visual investigation into, say, the seaweeds is what drives my research and the writing. So it's when the visual work comes first. So for my first book, An Ocean Garden, The Secret Life of Seaweed, I was making these very straightforward portraits of the marine algae using my scanner. And it was that process of scanning the image, having it come up onto my screen, and then working deeply with bringing the image to light made me think about what I was looking at so intently. The color, the form, why is this particular species vary so much from one specimen to another? And then as I'm working on it, all these questions arise, and I kind of jot down the questions, and those questions drive my research. As I was making The Curious World of Seaweed, my most recent book, which focuses on 16 iconic kelps and seaweeds, that's what would lead me into the questions of why this particular seaweed is so successful. What's interesting about its life histories? And that came from looking very intently, both as I was collecting in the intertidal zone, out on the reef, or out on the beach, and then again back in my studio. So that's kind of where art and science tie together for me in the process of looking closely and intently, and then that driving the research. But on the back end, once the book is made, and I'm out in the world, and I'm talking to this really diverse array of people about the topic, seaweed. It's the visual work, it's the power of the imagery that can take me into pretty complex science and have that be really accessible to whether it's elementary school kids, or whether it's a much more mature audience at an aquarium or a bookstore, or any of a huge array of audiences. So that art and science coming together allows this world to open in a more kind of substantial way than if I'm just presenting the artwork, or I'm just telling the science. I've actually just made 3 pieces that I'm pretty excited about. They evolved as I mentioned I was archiving my work, and I had been wanting to make these larger mural pieces that are like an ocean garden or a seaweed jungle. And so I was able to make those as I was archiving my imagery. I would kind of bring the elements together. So I've made 3 big murals that I call Ocean Jungle 1, 2, and 3. And they are designed to be as big as 78 inches by 60 inches, so 5 feet tall. And they're just about kind of communicating the interaction between color and form and a little bit of movement and gesture. So those are my 3 current. There's another series I'm very invested in, which is using my cyanotype prints and my scans in conjunction together. That is very exciting. The reaction I hope is, wow, I never thought seaweed could be like this. Having the scale be large is that it can feel like it's enveloping you a little bit, like being snorkeling or diving into the kelp forest. I'm very aware that it's divers that really are the ones who get to experience the incredible diversity of the kelp forest, and how do you bring that out on shore to an audience that doesn't get to go underwater. My favorite seaweed is the bull kelp, and the reason is because the bull kelp right now is experiencing a great deal of change and stress. And it's a majestic, majestic and magnificent kelp that grows on the north coast of California and up through the Pacific Northwest, through British Columbia and Alaska. And it can grow from 10 to 12 inches a day, up to 60 feet tall. And it does this just in a matter of months. So it's just this fabulous example of the power of sunlight and the ocean's nutrients through photosynthesis to create growth, to create biomass. Of course, I love them all. They're all so fabulous and diverse. But right now, that's my focus, because I think it's a story that needs to be told with our changing oceans. The bull kelp story is one that I'm very fascinated with, how it progresses, how it plays out in different regions along our Pacific coast. Sure. Some of the art that I've done with this bull kelp is I've made pretty large scale, very straightforward, iconic imagery of the bull kelp that has been used for posters, it's very easy to design with on the page. And then I've actually integrated that kind of iconic image with some historical image made by a wonderful lithographer named Alexander Postels, who made a series of work on Pacific Coast seaweeds and kelps in 1840. And I've made a piece that's kind of an homage to our kelp on the north coast here of California, where the kelp is not doing so well, where I've kind of reversed my image of the kelp into this ghostly figure that interplays with Alexander Postels' beautiful, beautiful lithograph. So as I was beginning to research the newest seaweed book, The Curious World of Seaweed, which focuses on these 16 particular stories, I realized that in looking at the history of the science, the taxonomic history, why this particular species is named what it is and what we know about it, that this taxonomic history, or the history of the science, has this this lineage to it that's kind of like a linked chain. And as you go back, there's actually a visual component to that history, which is, as these kelps and seaweeds were described for the first time, they also were, the pictures were made of them. And some of them are these very, very spectacular, usually lithographs. And these lithographs are available in various archives. And so Alexander Postels was this wonderful artist who was actually hired as the surgeon on board an exploratory expedition from Russia to Alaska in 1829. And he returned from that trip and partnered with the chief botanist at the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, Russia, and made this huge oversized folio called Illustrationes Algarum, which includes these huge lithographs of the seaweeds of Alaska. And the seaweeds of Alaska are very much part Alaska is usually the northern part of the range of our local seaweeds here in California, so it's very much of a connected story. And I had the great good fortune to visit this folio at the University of Southern California in their special collections, and then I kind of kept on them to say, when is that going to be digitized? And so that was part of the research that went into my book, and the digital files became available. And so I've been able to work as an artist with his work. And for me to work across time with my images, my contemporary images, working with his historical images, has created this kind of vector through time. And it of course implies, you know, a vector has an arrow on it, and it kind of goes from past to present and into the future. So the body of work where I'm working with these historical images is very much about this underlying question that where will these organisms be in the future, especially given our changing oceans. The book projects are very much driving forces behind all of my work, whether it's visual explorations or whether it's research or whether it's the bringing the research together into writing, into the writing part of it. So while I have gallery shows that come up or other design projects that I'm doing, it's these overriding book projects that really keep driving me forward. And they drive me forward not only in the research and writing, but also experimenting in the art making. So my newest project is following the bull kelp story, and I'm going to be using very different kinds of imagery. It's not going to involve my scanner, I don't think. It might incorporate that at some point. So I'm really trying to clear the decks, clean out my studio so that I can get to work on this whole new body of visual work that's very place-based. It's going to use old nautical maps and a lot of kelp surveys and QGIS. Anyway, new stuff, new stuff. I'm hoping we can keep our focus on the health of the oceans. The oceans are changing so rapidly in terms of our warming world, and this has a really profound effect on the kelps and seaweeds. And these bull kelp forests are very ephemeral, we're finding. They can go away quickly. So it really does keep me up at night to a certain extent. I'm very intent on keeping focus on the story of the kelp forests because they're profoundly important, and they are tied up in some of our the economies of man, even though they seem so wild. They are really tied up in fisheries and kind of a coastal anthropology. And the ocean is just harder to understand for us land-dwelling organisms. So it takes that much more effort to bring that world to life so that we can be better stewards, better conservationists, better restorative, you know, forces. So I'm working on how do I transition from being just an artist and a writer into being an activist, and how best can I bring my storytelling, my visual and more comprehensive storytelling to bear on ocean conservation issues. I guess that's what I is a kind of an overriding driver. Let me think about what I am. I need to come up with this kind of two-word tagline. I'm Josie Iselin, a photographer, author, and ocean enthusiast.